Thiyagaraja, thank you very much for joining me in my Atharamadiyawa channel, where I'm going to discuss within my resistance program the title Resistance from the Margins, right? And the reason I'm calling it that is that one thing that I saw in this particular resistance that started from April 2022 in Sri Lanka is that many different sectors of society, right? Different ethnicities, different classes, for once in my lifetime at least, got together to protest about one particular issue, like asking for better governance, better management, and kind of trying to push away people who have used undemocratic or corrupt means to stay in power. So it was quite, apart from heartbreaking to see what's happening, it was quite empowering in another sense, where many sectors who did not work together were finally working together for one particular cause. And something I saw about 2 weeks ago was the Pride Parade, where LGBTQ people also came out and made the same call, and for once fearlessly stepping out as they are, as who they were. I know you couldn't do it because you were not in Sri Lanka, right? But the fact that that kind of expression was given in a way accepted within that context was quite an overpowering thing to see, right? And that is connected to the fact of how LGBTQ people are treated in Sri Lanka. And I will ask you to give a breakdown of what the situation is with regard to the status. First, Vara, can I please ask you to introduce yourself? Because I know you're an academic and I know you're in abroad right now following your doctorate research. First, can you tell us who you are?
Thank you, Madhubhashini. I'm extremely honored to be part of this conversation. So I work at the University of Colombo and teach mainly peace and conflict related subjects at the Department of International Relations for the last few years. And
you're
currently
a senior lecturer there, Vara? You're a senior lecturer in the IR department. Okay.
Department. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in and out in many spaces, including working for different LGBTIQ NGOs and peace and reconciliation work, and then my work with the fisheries struggles in the north, and now I'm on to doing some doctoral work around queer communities and conflict affected settings. So this is my recent research. Yeah, apart from that, working with queer mobilizations in Sri Lanka. Yeah.
Shall we start from the very basics, Vara? And can you break down LGBTQ for us and discuss the difference also? Because I'm using this not as much for resistance as also awareness, that some of us might not quite know what exactly the term stand for and what the status is. Can we start there?
Yeah, sure. So generally, I think this LGBTIQ term or the acronym that keep on extending, adding number of letters time to time, start with basically L stands for women who are emotionally and what you call a romantic wise and also like sexually attracted to other women. And then gay, G stands for...
term is lesbian, right? L is for lesbian, right?
Lesbian, yeah.
Okay.
Gay, and it stands for men who are attracted to men emotionally, sexually, and romantic wise too. And then B stands for bisexual persons, individuals who are attracted to both same sex and opposite sex persons. And then T stands for transgender persons whose gender identity is different from what the gender identity that they were assigned at birth, right? So there you can find transgender women and transgender men also.
That would mean that they have physically transformed themselves into the opposite sex, Vara? Or just cross-dressing, or what does that exactly mean?
So the transgender, the idea of transgender means your gender identity is how you determine your identity as yourself, irrespective of your body. And then that identity might not necessarily correlate with the gender identity that you were assigned at birth.
Okay.
So for instance, if your gender identity that was assigned at birth is woman, but you feel you are a man inside, maybe later on changing it into a male's body is what we call a transgender man, right? So the idea of self-determination is very essential here than how you look or how you present yourself, right? So that's the whole idea. So like say if your gender assigned at birth was female, right? But sorry, if your gender assigned at birth was male and you feel like woman and you identify yourself as a woman, and you may change your body or you may change your physical feature later on going through a process. So that person would be identified as transgender woman or simply woman. That is also possible. That stands for transgender identity, which is more about the identity of gender, identity in relation to gender, whereas lesbian, gay, and bisexuality, those refers to one's identity in relation to sexual orientation. That doesn't necessarily, have to, or how do you say, compatible with what we see as transgender or gender identity. So you may find transgender women who are heterosexual. You may also find transgender men who are heterosexual. At the same time, you may already know transgender individuals who are bisexual, transgender individuals who are gay, trans lesbian, and trans gay. There are all spectrum of identity that goes along that way. And then I stands for intersex persons, individuals who are born with both male and female anatomic features.
Right? Repeat that word again, Vara, because that's a new addition, right? Even I did not know. What does I stand for?
Intersex persons.
Okay.
Intersex persons are referred to individuals who are born with, male and female anatomy. So I think there is a general tendency in the human population. There's a percentage of babies that are born as intersex babies. It doesn't mean they have equal percentage of both biological features, but it can be varied. But generally, it's possible to quite often it's possible to identify the babies who are born with similar features, but some babies can be identified little later on. So those babies are considered as intersex babies. In certain parts of
what is the percentage we are talking about, Vara? How often does that happen?
I think 2,000 per 100,000. Every 100,000 birth, there's certainly around. Yeah.
I see. Okay, right.
So that's a quite common tendency. That's in the medical world, it's a known phenomenon. So what used to happen is that when intersex babies are born, with the parents' consent, doctors would do surgeries to retain one sort of biological genital features and remove the other one.
And is that not followed anymore? Like, do they leave the choice for the baby later?
In certain part of the world now, they allow the baby to grow up and make the decision, which is the most advanced, most civilized form of addressing that situation. But countries like Sri Lanka, I think we still have a long way to go because we know it is still being practiced. Sometimes doctors do make their own decisions, even without consulting parents. We have known certain situations that has happened in the past. So that still continue to happen in the country, but this is also a phenomenon. But sometimes doctors don't even, sometimes it's not easy to recognize at birth as well. So it takes a while sometimes to appear those. Yeah. So that's LGBTI. And if you come to Q, it stands for individual who tend to question all these categorizations and would retain themselves as individual who questions all these identities and
Okay,
even
so Q is for question.
questioning.
I see.
Yeah. So
Where
that's
does the word queer come in, Vara?
it is also used interchangeably with queer.
Yeah.
So the question is also used interchangeably with queer. The whole idea of the essence behind those two terms is that you stay outside of these identities. You don't fit into these identities. You stand as somebody who deconstruct or somebody who's in constant questioning of these categorizations, which is also possible because there are theories emerging now, gender fluidity and indeterminacy and individuals' fluid identities are possible along this both spectrum. So there is this concept of queering identity formations in terms of sexual orientation and gender identities. Yeah. So there are individuals who do not want to be identified with any of the categories and who would continue to question. They would be represented by the letter Q, questioning.
That's so. With queer, you mean they will question, obviously, male, female, plus the other spectrum that you just define, all that.
Yeah. So I think that the whole the idea behind the queer theory or the concept of queerness is that it doesn't fit into. The moment you try to fit something into a fixed category or identity, you lose the queerness. The queer idea stands out with many things. I remember once Arjuna Parakrama, who was given a very, fragile task to introduce queerness, talk about queer in Sinhala to for a queer audience. He basically said queer for him stands as aula in Sinhala. In every terms, every means, every corner, every possible way, it's ekatika kaulne. The way we, like things that doesn't fit into what we understood as normal things, we always refer to as kaulne. So queer actually stands questioning was it considered as normal, what is considered as correct, what is considered as fixed, what is considered as acceptable.
All this time, Vara, I had taken queer to mean a synonym with gay or lesbian. So obviously I was wrong, no?
No, you are not wrong, but the whole idea, even the gay and lesbians are considered some kind of odd idea compared to heterosexual.
I think the term that Sugatapala Silva used for funny boy was Amuthu Ilandaria. So I would have taken the term Amuthu for. So
that actually kind of closer to Aula as well.
Right. Yeah. Aula seems more, I mean, it'll be very interesting for me to repeat this in Sinhala with you, Vara, to see how we get to these terms. Aula seems more degrading, that you all are confused. While as Ubuntu means, no, not confusion, just different. So my problem with the translation there is Aula is a kind of negative and can denote confusion, apart from not fitting in. So are there terms which are like accepted in Sinhala and Tamil for these words that you're defining now?
Well, I think it's a bit of a challenging enterprise to delve into local taxonomies of these terms. Because the whole conceptualization of these gender and sexual orientation-based identities, what we have right now is actually manufactured in the West. So it comes from a particular set of epistemological understanding about sexual and gender identity. Whereas when we bring it to and try to appropriate into our context, it's a bit challenging. In many ways, both one is that there needs to be some labor put it into.
Every time this happens, I'm going to digress a bit. So one of the challenges that you might have in queer activism here, could it also be someone saying these are all Western newfangled ideas, kind of implying that these were not there before, right? And then if you look at it, is that a fair charge or absolutely not? These are not newfangled Western corruption kind of thing that's coming in. So because this is a very and the next question is going to be about the Sri Lankan situation, right? And the challenges to kind of acceptance would definitely be cultural, based on our culture kind of thing. So would this kind of lack of similar words imply that we did not have terms for it, or that we did not recognize it, or that we have erased it or covered it up? And why is an English term so easily made ready for us? And why are we struggling? I know we are struggling with the Sinhala, but you as a Tamil can probably say what the situation of the Tamil community is as well, right? Because you're blessed with 3 languages, while as I am restricted to 2. So let's just take it in let's do the Sinhala first. What does it mean for us to be struggling to have words for these? Does it mean we don't have the concept?
I think it's a question that needs to set up another round of whole dedicated discussion on that. I think, like, one thing, because these concepts were manufactured or imported with the globalization of all these liberal values, and then all this, and then the expansion of civil society movements, right? The emergence of institutionalized liberal civil society movement in the country, like in 1980s, around that period. And in fact,
can we have your phone not shaking, Vara? It shakes a little bit. Can you leave it somewhere so that it doesn't shake? Yeah, just don't keep it in your hands.
Okay, so this is,
yeah, that's fine. Just don't hold it in your hands, that's all. Yeah, that seems fine.
This is fine.
Yeah,
okay.
There's a light behind you which is a bit disturbing. If you can just avoid the light, yeah, much better. Perfect. Yeah, perfect. Right. Okay, just don't touch it. Let's just go back to you were talking about, I asked you about Sinhala and you were going there. Let's do that, because it was shaking and it was very disturbing. So go to the beginning of that answer, Vara, please.
No problem. So when we talk about all these taxonomies in terms of why we don't have a Sinhala, or like why we are struggling to sort of localize these things, it's not that because these are aliens to us. It's not that these concepts are alien, these practices are aliens to us. It just, I think, the dominant way of mainstreaming these ideas is still much done through the way things have happened in the West, right? So, and then also this is done through mainly, a lot of civil society organizations and NGO, which are largely funded by Western donors and all, whether we like it or not. So there is that whole dilemma that comes with that too, right? Because the local knowledge production, sort of like the other non-NGO knowledge production entities, like universities, seems to be, delving into these kind of, new, innovative avenues to take the lead in that, because the social issues are often addressed, in the country by outside of the university and academia, quite often the case. So in that sense, I think the terms like LGBTIQ were manufactured in the West and brought to the country through the liberal NGOs and civil society work. In fact, the first LGBT NGO was formed in 1995 in Sri Lanka, although it's one of the earliest LGBT organizations in the whole region. Right, so we have been one of the pioneers in the region, but that's the situation, I think, that I know. But that doesn't mean that we haven't had LGBTIQ communities or we haven't had any of these practices as such. I think Sri Lanka is known as a country, or as Sri Lanka is known as a space or landscape that is, just a second. Hello, sorry, I got a call. No, so the Sri Lankan society, not, I shouldn't generalize Sri Lankan society. Sri Lanka as an island known for embracing things that are new to the society, and at the same time invoking a certain level of suspicion and conflict around that. Right, so there had always been things that coming onto the society from outside the island, and level of absorbing and level of resistance. This has always been going on, and it was not an easy process. It was never a smooth process. So the resistance or the criticism, as you said, these are Western. It's also somewhat should be understood in the context. There is always some kind of a resistance for these things, but at the same time, some kind of acceptance too, right? So if you look at the pre-colonial era.
Vara, before we go there, what is the legal situation of a queer community in Sri Lanka?
I think instead of queer community, if we say what's the legal situation of homosexuality.
Okay.
So Sri Lanka is one of the 68 countries that continue to criminalize homosexuality in the world. So it's one of the...
Yeah. When did this rule actually come? Was it during colonial times?
Yeah, it was the British colonial rulers that introduced this law around 1800. And then, so that's why I said, like, there is another argument as well that says what is Western is not the LGBTIQ identity, but criminalizing homosexuality is what we call Western, because it wasn't criminal.
That is exactly why I asked you that question, because if it was the British that criminalized LGBTQ people, and then we have to remember the British who colonized came at a very specific time in the history of Britain, like Queen Victoria, whatever, which was very, very moralistically very uptight. Like, for example, if they came during the Elizabethan times, you had Shakespeare writing sonnets for men, right? Or you take the beginning of civilization in the West, Greek and Roman, where homosexuality is more or less the norm. So maybe it was a period that the British came that really made this criminal because they believed it was criminal. And they put the law here. So in fact, the law that we defend as being against our culture is in fact a very British law, right?
It is colonial, I would say. It's part of the colonialism. So it has been imposed on the society in general as Victorian, sort of values and things. But
what is the British situation now? They are not still criminalizing homosexuality, right?
No, they have repealed it in 1960s, and then they have even allowed same-sex marriages.
But we are still keeping what they gave us, right, Vara?
Exactly.
They've gone beyond decriminalization. They've gone even up to marriage. The same people who made it criminal here, but we haven't moved much. We are still keeping to that what they told us.
Exactly. I think the
quite ironic.
Yeah. Irony is that even the colonizers have left. The remnants of colonial rule is being still preserved in our society because we still think along that line. So
very quickly again, I'm going back to pre-colonial times, Vara. Now, with regard to women, of course, I mean, we have Sigirian depictions there, where we can even now see how free that culture was as opposed to what the Victorian British told us morality was, right? Were there any examples that you can find in which there is evidence of homosexuality before they came open homosexuality? Or was it always like because I don't really see any residue of what may have been before the colonizers came?
There has been much research done on the pre-colonial sexuality and the gender part of the pre-colonial history, right? So what we have, there's this famous writing, one of the Goan, one of the Portuguese, I think governors, I don't remember his name, writing to his counterparts in Goa, explaining the sodomy practices in the kingdom, where he basically refers.
Sodomy is defined as what exactly? Homosexuality was called sodomy?
Yeah, like buggery practices, right? So he basically writes with a disgusting tone to say it is surprising to see it's quite normal that the palace practices such things. So it's the beautiful boys are sent to palace to be served, and then so and then what king does is never questioned, and citizens follows the suit of the king. But there is, I think, I have seen some tend to paint that the sodomy practices were quite common in the pre-colonial period, but I don't know whether we can argue for it. So what we can say as a bottom line is that regulating one's sexuality and gender identity was not a matter of the state before colonial period. The state there isn't any evidence to show that state was very much interested in regulating individual sexuality and sexual conduct and things like that.
Yeah, but your phone, either something is knocking your phone. You got to. Yeah. Just don't knock it, because it's such a homemade channel. I'm very careful that. Okay. Now your light is disturbing me. Right. Okay. Right. That's perfect. Yeah, leave it like that. So you are saying the state had nothing to do with personal intimate practices.
No, I think state, there is evidence that to prove that state has had an interest in regulating individual sexuality and
there is proof. You're saying there is proof.
No, there aren't.
There aren't. Okay, state had no connection with the intimate practices, but the British actually put rules in.
Yeah. So that's so my whole point is, I think what I would say, I don't know if I can argue that homosexuality was a norm as much as a heterosexuality even before the colonial rule in the country. I wouldn't say that. Yeah. But what I would say is that the society wasn't penalizing someone for their sexual orientation. And in fact, this nature of organizing and systems has allowed certain segments of the society to, publicly endorse homosexuality, which is what we can see from the letter that was written by the Portuguese officer to his counterpart in India, where he explained about the sodomy practices in the palace. Right? So that is somewhat there. So what we actually have right now is what we got from colonizers. What is colonial is criminalizing. What is native is being indifferent. Being, I don't know whether they celebrated homosexuality, but I think they, once whom you love is not the business of the state. There isn't any business for state to come and tell you whom you should love and whom you should be with, right? So that is what I would say is pre-colonial sort of way of dealing with this phenomenon. So what LGBTIQ community right now in Sri Lanka is asking also for not just a decriminalization, but the entire decolonization of regulating individual sexuality and gender identities. So it's basically a decolonizing movement that we still continue with this whole thingy. So that's why I said,
give me a regional kind of a snapshot of how things are. How is the situation in India? Are they equally like Sri Lanka? What is the regional situation with regard to homosexuality and law?
yeah, so in South Asia, there are 8 countries, right? And out of 8 countries, it's India, Nepal, and Bhutan, the 3 countries that have decriminalized homosexuality.
Oh, they have. Okay.
They have done.
Right.
The first country to criminalize homosexuality was Nepal. That was in 2007. The Nepalese Supreme Court issued a verdict making it not a crime and even directing the government to enact policies that promote rights of LGBTIQ community, right? Which was followed by India later on, like after I think 11 years. Indian Supreme Court reinterpreted the law, the same law. Like what we have is the exact copy of what.
Which year was that, Vara? India decriminalized? 2018. 18. So that was during the Modi government?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it was not done through the parliament, it was done through the Supreme Court.
Right. Okay. Mm-hmm.
The Indian Supreme Court is fairly empowered compared to a lot of other Supreme Courts. Right. So they can interpret the law and make laws. So the Supreme Court has interpreted the law in such a way that homosexuality isn't a crime. That's how they have decriminalized.
Okay.
2018. And in Nepal, it was also same. The Supreme Court was empowered, and they have managed to get it done. But the case of Bhutan is different. Bhutan, the decriminalization process was done through the parliament. It was the parliament that amended the law saying that homosexuality is not a crime. Whatever the sexual offenses under the particular provisions, they made an exclusionary clause saying that homosexuality doesn't fall under this category as a crime. So they decriminalized it. And what are the other countries?
Any way forward? So only those 3 countries, right, that decriminalized it?
Sorry?
In South Asia, only those 3 decriminalized it.
Yes.
And it's criminal in all the others, like Bangladesh, Pakistan, and all that. It's criminal. If in Sri Lanka, Vara, we were to do it, which is the process we have to take, through Parliament or through Supreme Court?
It depends on a lot of other factors. And I'll let's take the examples, right? So in India, the first attempt was made through the parliament, which ended up in a massive failure because there are a lot of conservative elements in the politics and they were not supporting it. So then they took up an independent path, that is to take it up with the judiciary. Judiciary is known relatively progressive among other judiciaries, made their decision and they fairly interpreted in a very progressive way and delivered the judgment decriminalizing all things. In Nepal, it was the judiciary again, right? And in Bhutan, they didn't go to judiciary. The parliament was, sort of, with the democratization process in Bhutan, the parliament was, very much embraced about these acceptance and things, and they have accepted.
So another reason, the parliament actually accepts it, you don't have to go to the courts, no? Basically. No. Right, yeah. I get that.
Because it's the offenses listed in the penal code, section 365 and 365A in Sri Lanka, that criminalizes homosexuality. So it's a law. So law has to be amended in the parliament, technically and legally. That should be the rational choice. But if you have a majority in your parliament that are not in favor of enacting such progressive changes into the legal system, then one needs to seek the avenues of judiciary. So this is what happened in India, and this is Nepal also did the same thing. But Bhutan, they were quite easy, and then both chambers approved it, and it became a law in, I think, 2020 or 21, I don't remember exactly. There are different situations in Pakistan and Bangladesh. Those 2 countries do not accept lesbian, gay, and bisexual identity. They are criminalized, but the transgender identities are accepted promoted and recognized in those two countries. Partly because there's a legacy of cultural acceptance of being transgender. Those societies has a sort of a space where the transgender community performs a cultural function in the society. They bless individuals because they are considered as embodiment of both male and female versions of the God, right? So therefore they have a social function in their society, so that they are somewhat naturalized and accepted. That doesn't mean there aren't any discrimination against them. There are discrimination, but generally the norm is they are part of the society. They should be accepted. Like in Bangladesh, they were given slots to enter into politics, and even the prime minister appears with transgender community in India. So there's so much of work around that.
Yeah, the Muslim religion will not accept homosexuality either, right, Tawara?
That's what the culturally propagated idea, and
Right.
that's what society. Like interestingly, in Pakistan is the first country in the world to include a transgender woman in their delegation to the UN. Right, a country that continued to criminalize homosexuality still accept transgenderism. So there are these sort of dualities is present in those two countries.
Also, since you spoke about transgender, there's a huge community in India, right, of transgender people who actually have their own pageants and all that. That's a different, like an absolutely powerful segment. Is it in what's Indian situation for transgender?
In India and Nepal, both countries have relatively strong acceptance towards transgender community as well, right? And there are specific transgender affirmative actions focusing on transgender communities' inclusion and their rights. And particularly the closest state to us is Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu has special transgender expert board to advise government on transgender policies and inclusion and their welfare, and the quota system for them in education and every places to empower them. But also culturally, they perform certain cultural acts, like they're part of the religious cultural practices in the country, and then there's a communal identity as well.
Forgive me, but I have to ask you something because of my ignorance. What is a cross-dresser as opposed to a transgender person? What is it?
Cross-dressing is something, a practice that someone is someone's desire is to dress like their opposite sex or opposite gender.
Right.
Right.
And that group is not represented in the LGBTIQ spectrum.
I think cross-dressing is also considered as I think it cut across most of these identities. Okay. So cross not necessarily confined to LGBTIQ community per se. Even heterosexual person can also cross-dress. Right? Let's say a heterosexual man can also do cross-dressing.
And they're still within the heterosexual category.
Yes. And when a heterosexual woman can cross-dress. At the same time, a transgender woman can cross-dress, or transgender man can cross-dress, and also like a gay man can cross-dress, and a woman can also do that.
And I think India has a very strong community of cross-dressers then, of men who wear saris and go. It's just something that I have seen, which I wanted to check for a long time, what exactly the community was.
Madhu, that's a good question, because now see the term cross-dressing, right, is a harasvilasita in Sinhala. Like it actually, as I said, comes from the Western taxonomy, right?
In Sinhala, what was it?
Harasvilasita.
Harasvilasita. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So that's the exact translation of the term, but it captures somewhat the essence of the meaning. Now, I think these terms are produced in the West with particular meaning and context. When it's trying to capture the realities of non-Western world, the reality that are quite dissimilar and quite nuanced. It's quite difficult to explain. This is what happens. So what you must have seen, what you have seen in India is that the Hijra community, or it's actually transgender community. They can also be identified as transgender community, right? And they can also be identified as Hijra community, like their own identity.
What is the word you're using, Vara?
Hijra.
Hijra.
Yes. Hijra.
Okay.
So that's how they are known in certain parts of India. And in Tamil Nadu, they are known as Aravani. And in Sri Lanka, they are also known as sometimes Nachi, in Tamil, Nachi in Sinhala. So I think there are individuals, transgender persons, particularly transgender women or men, if I use to the gender that was assigned to them, it's men who identify themselves as transgender women, right? They dress up according to their identity, what they think as their identity, and that is for outside world maybe something like a cross-dressing, right? But for them it's not cross-dressing because they think as women. For them it's their dress, right? So cross-dressing involves, let's say, if a trans woman dressing a sari is not cross-dressing, because the self-determination is very key in identity recognition politics. That it's the woman, if she decides and she thinks herself as a woman, dressing a sari around her body is not crossing, is not cross-dressing, because her gender identity is woman.
Yeah.
Although we see her body is in a different identity format.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so that's we call transgender communities, but not cross-dressing. But we have seen people, we have seen men who don't identify themselves as transgender persons, but they would like to cross-dress. Right. And they'll come to our organizations and, secretly cross-dress and sit for a while and then go. That's their way of expressing that desire. Right? So that we would call cross-dress, because they wouldn't identify themselves as transgender women. They would identify as man, but they just like to cross-dress. So they are crossing the other side of the gender identity. This is quite strong in India because not every trans woman in India is preferred to go through the surgery and all this, medical transformation, because they have been historically having this cultural way of expressing their gender identity. There is a space for them in the cultural pockets where they could be trans women, right? Not necessarily have to have the medical process going through. But I know there are women who have been going through the process, who can be identified as transsexual persons because they have done the surgery and all. Yeah. So that is something. So that is why I say, like, it's quite, there's a lot of, how do you call, blending between gender identity and sexual orientations, between one's gender expressions in our societies. The moment we try to use these different terms, what happens, like, we try to compartmentalize, try to enforce those rigid boundaries between these fluid, floating identities sometimes, right? So that is the whole challenge that we have when we do use it. So sometimes we have, like, for example, I would say, like, the identity about Nachi, the Nachi identity in Sri Lanka is often referred to effeminate gay men and trans women, right? It encapsulates both gender and sexual orientation identity, right? It doesn't necessarily demarcate a line between these two. Right?
I can imagine the complexities of trying to label such fluidity. Yes,
exactly.
I see your point. Mm-hmm.
What has happened with the whole NGOization of the movement, and then because the donor taxonomy has to be used in reporting and working, and it also become quite it can also become another politics of respectability, what is considered to be respectable. So identifying one as trans woman in Sri Lanka is considered to be slightly more respectable than identifying themselves as Nachi.
Nachi is a Tamil word, Vara?
I think its roots is in South India. I think
Okay.
like a dancing community, but it has been adapted both in Tamil-speaking queer community in the Northeast and also like in the Sinhala-speaking queer community in the South.
I see.
Right?
Same term.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was the term quite often used in the subculture before mid 1990s, because I think like before all these NGOs jeered into with all these terms. I mean, locally it was known as Nachi community. There's a
But
particular
not in the
subculture.
sense of dance or anything, no? In this particular specific meaning that you use.
Well, it also a cultural identity, because you have certain practices associated with being a transgender person. You have a trans mother who looks after you. So the whole setting is different than what we have right now. What we see right now, this institutionalized transgender activism and LGBT activism. So that's
Well, it's the same thing with taking feminist concepts from the West, and then us realizing not everything fits. And it's the same thing that even I think you all are working with, that a homegrown kind of identity is difficult when the concepts are coming from another center.
Yeah. And I have a half a minute break. I need to plug my phone into the battery.
Okay. So while you do that, Vara, I'm going to lead to one of the reasons I'm talking with you is like it actually joins in with the Aragalaya. You can do what you have to do, Vara, while I talk. With the Aragalaya at Golf Face, because we saw, I think, 2 weekends ago, the Pride community and people who supported the Pride community coming out in very open expression of that. But do you have? I saw the pictures, which were like quite attractive and quite breathtaking, in the power of not being afraid to show what you are. The colors and all that. Do you have any pictures you can show? What are you like plugged in now?
Yes, I can. Just a second. I just have to.
Is this? And I know something was held in Jaffna a few days ago. What exactly was that in Jaffna? And Bara, before I get there, I mean, being a Sinhala person, I know the reactions that homophobia, we have it quite strong within our communities as well. What is the situation in the north of the country among the Tamil community? Bara, do you know?
I think. Well, I've worked with the queer community in the north since I think like 2017, and my experiences being in and out of that space, and the experience of my colleagues and fellow activists is it's not very dissimilar to what happens in the south, right? But at the same time, I think because there's also the other elements that plays into the context in understanding these differences. One thing is that because of the war, certain things weren't happened in the same way that has happened in the south, right? When you come to the north, so because of the whole NGOization, whole liberal waves, didn't affect the north the same way that south was affected.
Yeah.
Because of the war, and at the same so then LGBT activism took,
second place probably. No, there were bigger problems that you had to face as a community. Right. Yeah.
Yes. So Hinduism traditionally considered to be a tolerant sort of. There is a space for transgender identity in Hinduism, but that doesn't necessarily.
Vara, Hinduism would also, I'm guessing here, might be more sympathetic to same-sex unions. You think?
I don't know, to be honest, but I know for transgender identity there is some reference to sort of practices and tolerance.
Right.
But we shouldn't also forget the fact that as much of the south is Victorianized, of course the north too, right? There's a middle class.
Exactly. And the missionary education, I think, was stronger in the north than in the south. So I can imagine how much of that also would have affected them.
Yeah. So that part is also there. So there is, issues around that also. And when you talk about North, I would also include the Muslim community here, which has, very, strong resistance to this, and the Catholic community to the Christian community. So I think it's another challenge that we have to face. But fortunately, in the mainstream politics, it's the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism still dominant. So because it continued to do the job that all these conservative forces wanted to do, so they don't seem to be very prominent in taking over the, resistance against LGBTIQ rights in the national.
Because it's already done by a different community.
Exactly. It's by the Sinhala Buddhist nationalists. So
exactly. Any chance of that changing, Vara? What do you think with this kind of, I mean, this is a very odd time that we have seemed to step out of historical time where everybody's protesting, right? But things go back to, I don't know whether they will, but if they go back to normal, do you think this kind of acceptance, which the parade, you think it will last, or whether there'll be people who will go back to the status quo and say no?
We don't know. It all depends on the dynamics of the Aragalaya and what's going to happen immediately after the Aragalaya, right? When I started working on the LGBTIQ issues in around 2015, I never thought that there would be a chance that we could see a political party representing the parliament would accept LGBTIQ rights, right? So, but 3 years later, NPP declared they would endorse LGBTIQ rights and decriminalize too.
That's National People's Power.
Exactly.
Right.
Led by JVP and Anru Kumara. And but later on, we started seeing individuals like Yurudika Premachandra and Harsha De Silva, and of course Shanak and Rasamanika from Vatican, right? And started endorsing LGBTIQ rights, right? So there is some kind of opening that has never witnessed, that we have witnessed in the country. And of course, Jeevan Tondaman also recently endorsed it, saying that he had a chat with Justice Minister on the issues of LGBTIQ community. But I don't know whether they are just tokenistic, but even it's important that tokenism is now made visible, which was not the case before. But a recent study that was done around 2021, when the nationalism was quite popular during the COVID, indicated that a survey, that island-wide survey, indicated that more than 60% of the population are not in favor of decriminalization.
More than 60%?
They're not in favor of decriminalizing homosexuality.
Okay.
But majority has said LGBTIQ community should not be discriminated. Now, this nuance is quite often overlooked by the people who work on the LGBTIQ issues, or even the civil society. Now, how do you understand the community that says, okay, we shouldn't decriminalize homosexuality, but they shouldn't be discriminated? Now, how do you convert this sentiment into a political action or a political policy? Is a challenge that we have, because we are always, preoccupied with, knowledge and thinking that we have gained or we have been seasoned in the, particular set of values, which often relate to the liberal and Western values, right? So how do we understand this duality, if I say in Western ideas? I think I remember once Uyangoda, vaguely remember it must be Uyangoda, who referred to the status of Buddhism in the constitution. When it's come to reconciliation, all these, inclusivity politics, he basically said, there are certain symbols that are quite sentimental to the population, right? those symbolic things need not to be touched, however much we dislike it. But you can do everything else to gain whatever you want. As long as so there are certain value-based politics that takes over the dominance over, right-based politics in the country. So we need to understand this contradiction, but also to find a way, creative way to how to advocate for policy changes. So for instance, Sri Lanka is one of the few countries that, accepts transgender persons and also allows them to get free transition surgeries to the national, health system, which isn't in the case in the West. Transgender person has to pay for their surgeries, things like that. So
I didn't know that. So okay, that's a very positive thing to hear.
Well, in a way it's positive, but in a way it's negative because you have to medicalize your body to get your identity recognized.
I see. Only then.
Yeah, only then, because as long as you would end up being a woman look like a woman, you are accepted. Anything in between isn't accepted.
I see. Okay, I see your point there.
So that is why sometimes when we see trans women coming out to the media, they are often trans women who would speak to the cis identity, like the identity of a woman-like identity. Anything in between isn't often promoted in the media, right? So this is also another challenge that transgender activism has to go through. And we also have to go through the same challenge, because when we talk about gay men, gay rights, we often see, cis-looking gay men are being promoted in the media as gay because they look more respectable. This is what the whole idea of, what is acceptable is often confined to respectability.
Can you define cis women, cis look?
Cis look means one's gender identity confirmed with their own, so let's say,
what is exactly the word, Vara? SCIS?
CIS.
What does it stand for?
It stands for, what do you call it? Cis looking, just a second.
Okay, I'm sorry, I get fascinated with words and,
It's fine. I mean, there are so many things I even have to recall myself.
I'm probably asking very obvious things because the moment you say cis, I was thinking of sissy and whether it's actually that.
No.
Yeah.
I have it in my glossary here.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay. I think it's basically, let's say, my gender identity is compatible with the identity assigned to me at birth. So let's say if I was born as a male child and I'm still behave as a man, that is cis.
Okay.
If I was given a female identity and I behave as a woman, that is cis. Any incompatibility between these two is not cis.
Okay. So basically standard.
Standard. So, but let's say like you have seen women who are not behaving as, identity of a woman, right? They wouldn't be considered as cis as such.
Yeah.
Right. So they can be, what do you call masculine women, right? And there can be like very feminine men like effeminate men, like trans, non-binary identities, individuals who doesn't want to be identified with the binary, either man or woman. They can embody both. They can embody a mix of it, right? Anything. So any of those identities aren't welcomed in the country. What is welcome? If you're a trans person, either you have to be a trans woman or a trans man, right? You can't be a non-binary person. You can't be a Nachi. Right? So what happens again? The binary is being reproduced in a medicalized. So that's why I said you have to medicalize.
I understand.
Yeah.
It's progressive, but within a framework.
It is. I said it's one step forward, but not radically emancipatory.
Right. Okay. So I'm going back to the question, Vara, which I asked you. In the event that I think you answered by saying you don't know. In the event of things going back to normal and with 60% actually not in favor of decriminalization, right, of the community, is there any hope of things changing for your community? What do you think? Where would the fight go?
I think the community has to work hard, first thing, to convince politicians and bring this to the mainstream public discourse. The survey that I was...
And one of the problems that I see is that we still haven't realized most of the morality that we are talking about being part of our culture is actually the Victorian morality given to us by the westernized people. Because that's, it's part of a larger fight. If you take women and their dress code and the way we are supposed to dress, cover up our bodies like as much as we can, kind of language also came with the West. And we forget that when we are fighting, saying this is our sadacharya or culture. So it's all a part of that, isn't it, Vara, also?
So which is why a greater coalition building, working together with a lot of other oppressed movements is quite important and vital for us to, advance our struggle too. Right.
And I think this parade signaled that, no, because there were people saying, no, women's rights as well. It wasn't just LGBTQ also. And, women also fighting for other things within that.
Yeah, basically queer movement it's cut across a lot of other, oppressions and try to bring people together and giving everybody who wants to take a critical stance of oppression space. The Pride Parade that happened on the 8th of June is basically an Aragalaya Pride. Basically how queer community wanted to bring their support for the ongoing common Aragalaya protest, resistance against undemocratic rule and all these, important rulers, right? That they cannot deliver what public needs. So that's a very interesting way of, bringing an intersectional approach to the struggle for democracy and also LGBTIQ liberation.
And intersectional, right? If you were to define it, I think important is where we show how many different things can intersect and not be in just one category. And intersectional studies, I think, are very important, where, gender and class. Aragalaya is a super textbook case for intersectionality, gender, class, and, sexual identity, everything is cutting across. Vara, do you have pictures of Aragalaya? Because I saw some of the most stunning images. And
I do.
Aragalaya also has a lot of art in it.
Yeah.
So maybe we can share some.
Yeah. I'm gonna show you some photos.
Even in social media here, there was a lot of the flag, the colors. Do you know how it came about? The rainbow colors. What the link is, Vara, to the rainbow colored flag and this community? Who made it?
I don't remember exactly. There was a history. Well, I need to remind you.
I think you can easily Google that. It's just that also the spectrum of color, the differences probably stand for that.
And the inclusivity of diverse identities. And just a second. I'll share you the photos. Yeah. Photos. Let me see.
You'll have to put screen share, I think, first, Vara.
In there? Okay. screen sharing, start broadcast. Can you see that?
Right, that became very famous here. You know, that dress and an absolute superbness of the way she carried it.
Yes, this is an interesting photo, and I also saw a debate around women on the motorbike and her gesture of looking at.
At a surprise, no? Yeah, it's a very symbolic photograph.
Quite symbolic, yeah. And this is another photo that was also popular.
And there's a very huge flag, no, that they're all carrying.
Yeah, they actually made it. They wanted to have a 10 meters long flag. So they put a lot of effort to buy the pieces of clothes and put it together. So that's I think those are the two most important photos that I would
there's a
say.
huge community of color and song, and there was a joy that is unconnected to the suppression that they can have.
Yes.
Right. But thank you, because I wanted a clarification of these many terms and the situation here, and you showed it very well by saying it's not just positive dance things. There are a lot of other things which are happening and which are not very, very good. But there is a fight, and a fight that might have to connect many people together. And
yes,
little bit we have seen progress, like visa cases, Sayapit, like Frangapanni, like at least a film came out, and I think Handagam also had the final scene had the cross-dresser. In the West, the film tradition has been quite old, Brokeback Mountain or something, but it's quite new here. And
Madhubhasini, there had been films that centered around, or at least spoke about this queerness in Sinhala films. The first one was the Malatno in Bamaru. Yes.
By
that was the
whom,
first. I don't remember the director and producer, but that was the first sort of film that talked about the queerness.
Okay, what year are we talking about?
I think it's something around, Jesus, I don't remember.
But
okay,
probably
Malatno in Bamaru. Yes, just a second.
And that was accepted here, Vara? There was no problem?
I think, just a second. It was in 1982. Chandraratna Mapitigama, stars Joe Abevikrama, Ajit Sinadatsa.
So the celebrities starred in it. I see. Is it available on YouTube?
I'm not sure it's on YouTube, but yeah, there is a I don't know. I haven't watched the movie either.
It's very interesting. Okay, so there was a tradition. Anything else?
No, I wouldn't call it tradition or not. There was no such self-censorship, right? Because people were producing these, stories and the artistic pieces.
If you look at it carefully, even the Hindi Bollywood, very close bromance or whatever you call it, very close relationship, which are not named as anything but friendship. But
But go to the extent to explain the Madalduwa story as a romance story, right? And there are different ways that queerness have been captured by the literature and art in the history of Sri Lanka. But what we see right now is that there wasn't a movement as such to win over the rights of LGBTIQ community until late 1990s. So the movement have now 25 years old, now 28 years. So it has become quite visible. So people now see, hear, write, and talk about these things. But it doesn't mean they did not know about it. The point is people know these things in their own way, not the way that West
Not
has
open
started.
discussion, not labeling, not getting it into
You
the
know, the Sri
open. Yeah.
Lankan way is like, "Dannawa, danne naha wage innawa."
Yeah,
You know,
which is a way of living.
living. So that breaking that silence is very important to bring a positive change, right? So what has happened, what has been happening right now is that people try to break this silence and people try to be, outspoken about the issues, which is more
Have you ever
important.
like that spoken about lesbianism like water did? Or like was it water or fire? Like India, where there was a film about Shabana asked me, what's the film, Bara? Was it
In that,
Fire?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have the lesbian relationship shown in any of the movies here?
Yeah. What was this famous movie? There was a famous one. Whose one is that? Lesbian relationship movies. Yes, it was the
In
stories.
Sinhala.
Huh?
In Sinhala.
In Sinhala. Yes, it's an award-winning
Oh,
movie.
Sandra, the Hadagama's one.
Yes, exactly.
Right. That's the one I was also talking about. With Atharamadiyawa, right?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know.
That's a very recent one. Yeah.
Yeah. Then there's what is that? I don't remember the name. Well, I know the movie. It's just like
It's a matter of Googling. I don't worry when facts are not. Which
no.
other girl? Was it something like Me Mage Salai?
Is it Memage Sandai? I'm not sure. It's a different one.
But
There's
that's the
two.
thing. Yeah, we had Anoma Jinadari actually coming forward, no, with her clothes off.
Yeah, I think.
And that became very famous. You're right. So yeah, there is a very good example for it. This is seen with Tamil cinema. Vara, is there a tradition of showing homosexuality there?
Well, I'm not very much exposed to Tamil cinema as much as I'm exposed to Tamil cinema. But I've seen like in the Tamil commercial film industry, there had been productions before. But again, quite often they end up in such a way that endorse the heterosexual norm.
Right. So it's more implication than outright discussion. No?
Up until recently, with the whole tide changing up in India, people started talking about it more and more. Same as and commercial industry also taking up this as something that can be sold. Sellable topic. It has become a sellable topic in the market, right? So, like recent movie that we know in Sinhala, Kanchana, the transgender idea, and then associating it with it became quite popular in Sri Lanka as well, right? It's an Indian commercial movie.
I see.
Right?
Kanchana, okay.
Kanchana. The famous actor Ranjan Ramanayaka was starring the movie, and I don't know the other. I didn't watch the Sinhala version, but I watched the Tamil version. So it's quite, this topic is becoming more and more mainstreamed. So which is why the resistance against that is also become quite visible.
Exactly. So the more you talk about it, the more the way will. Right.
Yeah.
So Vara, thank you, because I think talking about things which are not discussed much is also a path to liberation, because a lot of
queer
things.
folk, your existence is resistance for us. What we say to queer folks is like your mere existence as queer person is also an act of resistance, because our struggle is often to survive our being ourselves, and our antagonist, the aim is to erase the queerness. When the forces are trying to erase the queerness, your mere existence become an act of resistance. So that's just
It can't be easy. I mean, I can imagine the difficulties entailed in that for us. So thanking you for the courage and the fight you do for yourself and everyone else, and also coming here to speak about what kind of resistance you are engaged in and how it actually fed into the Aragalaya movement also was important, because this is a moment where many different sectors, many of us are trying to ask for a better deal with regard to our own country. So thank you, Vara. I will speak with you in Sinhala as well, where the terms I think might be more difficult to actually define. But
I'll come prepared.
yes, yes. No, even if you prepare, I don't think there are words anyway. You might have to create a few. And so thanking you, I will end this English discussion for the moment. Wishing you all the best also, Vara, in your PhD work and your activism as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madhu, for having me. And it was lovely to ventilate these topics and also to exchange it. Yeah, I hope I did some kind of justice for your questions.
At least for me, a lot of things were clarified, which were not very, very clear. And these are vital things that all of us should know. So thank you for that as well. Okay.